I will talk about the UN Climate Summit, COP27, in the next 10 minutes or so, and I plan to make 4 brief points. My first point is just to help everybody contextualize COP27 a little bit. COP27 will be indeed one of the most important international climate events that we will have this year. It is scheduled under an African leadership, country of Egypt, in mid-November this year. In the past, within the UN climate negotiations, various African countries have played very important roles in steering international climate diplomacy. For example, in 2011, we had the COP in South Africa, which resulted in something called the Durban Mandate, which was widely perceived as the starting point of negotiating and finally adopting the landmark Paris Agreement. I think the most important thing for colleagues to understand here is when we look at UN climate negotiations, the negotiations themselves are undergoing a quite important transition. A transition from negotiating and discussing ambition to implementation. In other words, a debate or discussion around what countries should do as in their climate targets, how much they should, reduce their emissions, or, for rich countries, how much they should, how much finance they should provide to developing countries to actually delivering those commitments. And indeed, after years of negotiations, primarily focusing on adopting, climate rules at the global level, I think the critical issue now with regard to international climate politics is moving to the country level, what countries are doing domestically in their implementation. So I think the bottom line message here is increasingly countries' domestic climate action will be as important as the international negotiations. Having that said, and my second point is the negotiations in Egypt later this year will still see a number of very important issues to be addressed. If you look at the history of UN climate negotiations, the previous sessions and COPs have resulted in 2 pairs of imbalance, in my view. One imbalance is the imbalance between the issue of mitigation and adaptation. So to reduce emissions versus how to adopt or respond to the impacts of climate change. The other pair of imbalance is the imbalance between ambition and climate finance. COP27 will address these 2 pairs of imbalance by advancing 3 important issues, namely climate finance, climate adaptation, and something called loss and damage. Specifically, when it comes to climate finance, many colleagues may know that back in 2009, industrialized countries have pledged to provide at least $100 billion to developing countries by 2020. That promise, up until this day, has largely been unfulfilled. So the task of COP27 is to basically urge industrialized countries to catch up with the commitment that they made. The COP will also discuss, in addition to the quantity of climate finance, the quality of it. Namely, how can we better balance finance that goes into mitigation and adaptation? And also, how can we strengthen or enhance the share of grants in international climate finance vis-a-vis other forms, such as loans? So that's, I think, those are the kind of key finance-related issues at COP27. Moving to adaptation, this issue has long been neglected vis-a-vis the issue of mitigation. I think comparatively speaking, adaptation is a much more diffuse issue. It is hard to attract finance, and it is also an issue that is highly regional or national specific. But I think many of us are indeed hoping to use the opportunity presented by an African COP to make progress on this critical issue that is dear to the heart of many African countries. A key issue that will be negotiated in Egypt is a future global goal for adaptation. Moving to the third issue, loss and damage. The idea of loss and damage is, we as a global community is clearly lacking behind, progress needed when it comes to mitigation and adaptation. So unfortunately, there will be losses and damages associated with climate impacts. Should rich countries provide in a straightforward way a compensation to climate vulnerable countries when they encounter those losses and damages? This has been a highly political and politicized issue within UN climate negotiations. For years, this issue has been stalled as a result of resistance and oppositions from industrialized countries. But the issue is also gaining momentum among developing countries, in particular vulnerable countries such as island developing countries and many African countries as well. And I think the global climate community is indeed hoping for more concrete progress to be made on this particular issue. Specifically, whether a dedicated financial mechanism can be created to address loss and damage. Moving to my third point, I just talked about the policy issues around the COP, but I think it is also important for us to look at the politics around COP27. I think it is quite notable when we look at international climate politics, the conditions in recent years are quite different from 6 or 7 years ago when the Paris Agreement was reached. If we look at around the world, China's relationship with the West, in particular the United States and European countries, have deteriorated. We have an ongoing hot war in between Russia and Ukraine, and the COVID pandemic is still, affecting different parts of the world. And all of this generate risks of economic recession, inflation, energy, and food crisis. And I think the global climate agenda will not be insulated from those global turbulence. If we look at, for example, the European countries, they are actively reconciling or wrestling between their climate ambition and their energy security concerns. The US has also suffered very recent climate setbacks with the failure to pass the so-called Build Back Better Act in Congress and the Supreme Court ruling on the case of EPA versus West Virginia. And China is also distracted on its climate ambition, largely because of the domestic COVID and economic difficulties. Adding on top of all of this is this persistent tension between northern countries and southern countries within the UN climate framework. I think all of these geopolitical clouds, if you will make COP27 a highly contentious meeting, and we will see a lot of the geopolitical issues come to the fore later this year in Egypt. Let me just conclude with a few words on China. I think compared to COP26, the climate summit that we had last year in Glasgow, China's role in this climate negotiations this year might be a little bit less prominent. And this is partly because of the issues that will be debated at this COP. As I mentioned, primarily adaptation, finance, and loss and damage. Those issues, I think we will see in general a position from China as offering solidarity with other developing country partners, but not probably being right under the spotlight as the way it was in Glasgow. But still, the country will be quite important for the success of the COP. I will pay close attention to the EU-China engagement in the run-up to the COP, but also US-China climate engagement. At home, a very important issue is whether China will commit to any new climate pledges at all this year. If we recall what happened last year, as previous speakers have already mentioned, China committed to no more coal project overseas. And the year before, the carbon neutrality and carbon peaking pledge was made. Whether there will be similar announcement this year, I think is a big question mark. And also of critical relevance to other developing countries. And also, as other speakers have already mentioned, is the issue of the implementation of the overseas coal moratorium. Will we see loopholes in its execution? And probably also, more importantly, is whether China will find ways to scale up its support on renewable energy sources to much of the developing world. I think those are the issues for all of us to watch from a Chinese perspective in the run-up to COP27. And with that, let me turn it back to you, Bangui. I look forward to the Q&A. Thanks.